Good morning, everyone. This is the fourth presentation in the series of 6 classes. Today, we're going to be talking about the University of Montana and Montana newspapers. Before I get started, I have a couple of questions or observations. First of all, did anybody go to the presentation by Professor Borgonovo last week about Irish revolutionaries and the American West? Anybody go to that who'd like to report on what happened there? Okay. Well, as I've said before, I would encourage your comments and questions as we go through the class. I have my chat window up if you want to type in a chat. I'll pause occasionally to ask if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question orally on camera. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. And I'm also available to answer questions or comments on email. My email address is paul3707@aol.com. And my book is still available. If you send me a check for $29 at 2555 North Price Road, number 1-2015, Chandler, Arizona, 85224. I'll send you a book as soon as I receive your check. Someone says on the chat, I went. I don't know who that is, or if you would like to unmute yourself and say anything about it. The chat is, yes.
I did go. I've never followed Irish history. I was quite surprised that 100 years ago, how much turmoil there is and how much turmoil has gone on through their history. It was really very interesting.
Good. Can you name any of the revolutionaries that were mentioned?
Oh, I can't remember the names, but the Dur something or other. Okay. But no, I can't give you the names. It's good I went.
Okay, good. Well, and I just have one other question about just following up on the Butte material. I do want to get off Butte and get on to other things, but the question as to Butte is whether the end of mining there was inevitable, whether despite Anaconda Company's malpractice and all the things that they did, whether the mines and smelter would have shut down in any event. And where I've come out on that is that I think it probably was inevitable, because the problem was that the copper, it wasn't that there wasn't copper there or copper available, perhaps under the city of Butte or deeper in the pit. The problem was that the copper was more expensive to get out than the copper in the mines in Chile and Mexico and elsewhere. And copper prices were quite low because of the reduced demand for copper. So that any rational capitalist corporate executive would have concluded that Butte's copper was just too expensive. It could not be mined economically, even though there might be copper still there. And the economic thing to do would be to shut down the mining and the smelter, regardless of the inconvenience to the people in the community. So I don't know if anyone would disagree with that, but it's unfortunate, but it was just one of those situations where mining came to an end and Butte had to bear the consequences of that. So I think that's all I want to say, unless there are any other comments about that. Okay, hearing none, let's go on to the University of Montana. I will take as long as it takes to go through this, and if we run over with newspapers until next week, that's okay, because I think this is something that might be of particular interest to particularly those of you in Missoula. First of all, the book that I'm relying on primarily is a book that was written by Professor H.G. Merriam in 1970, published in 1970. It was commissioned by President Panzer in 1968 as a part of the university's 75th anniversary. It was to be an official history of the University of Montana. And it's really an excellent book. I acquired a paperback copy of it a number of years ago. The book has gone out of print. I have tried occasionally to determine whether it will ever be reprinted, and nobody really seems to know. Professor Merriam was at the university between 1919 until he retired in 1954. He was actively involved in faculty politics. He was an accurate reporter. He was a gentleman and a scholar. He organized his book according to who the presidents were in sequence. And in writing my chapter, I have followed his material very carefully, and have quoted him a lot, have cited the pages, because he's the authority. I'm not. I'm just channeling Professor Merriam, even though his book isn't now available to speak for itself. There is a secondary source that I also relied on, which is a book that President George Dennison wrote just before he died in 2017. Dennison supposedly had started to write a book updating Merriam's book with history since 1970, including the time when Dennison was president between 1990 and 2010. But he stopped in the middle. It's not clear why he stopped in the middle. And he instead wrote a biography about Professor Morton Elrod, who was an influential early biology professor. There was, at least at one time, an Elrod Hall named for him. And some of the early material about the university's general history is in Dennison's book. So I've also cited to Dennison's book. They disagree with, he disagrees with Merriam from time to time. And so I've tried to be accurate to those sources. Nobody knows, why the Merriam book has not been reprinted. I think I will try to find out. I started it on that trail yesterday, and I didn't have time to finish it. But it's, when Stan Cohen and Miller did their illustrated history of University of Montana, 2004, they cited to Merriam as the authoritative history on the university. And why the authoritative history on the university has not been kept in print, I really have no idea. I don't know do any of you know? Do any of you know why the Merriam book is out of print, or what has become of it? Or any of you scholars of Merriam? Okay, well, I think that one other preliminary comment. I started doing a paper about Merriam's book for my 2017 annual presentation to the Montana Men's Group here in Phoenix. And as I got into that in the fall of 2016, the news broke about President Royce Ekstrom's firing and all of the turmoil and controversy that has arisen out of the enrollment situation. And so I decided that I really needed to also write about the more modern history of the university from 2011 to the present, particularly with reference to enrollment. So I will talk about that toward the end of this part of the presentation. But that again is not something that I had originally intended to do. Again, by way of background, I went to the University of Montana for 4 years, from 1957 to 1961. I was a member of Central Board for 3 years. I was president of the Associated Students for a year, 1960, 61. I acquired then some understanding of the history and politics of the university, not in any detail at all, nothing near what Professor Merriam has written about. But I've followed that down through the years and have a sense of that history and appreciation. And I approach this respectfully and objectively, and trying to stay true to Merriam as best I can as he goes through this trail. It's an uneven trail, and the university has had its difficulties over the years. And the remarkable thing, I think, for me in following it has been the dedication of people at the university, the resilience, the desire to make the university as good an institution as possible, given all of the limitations, constraints, and issues. And so I come at it from that point of view. On the other hand, you have to be objective and look at what happened and just see the difficulties that occurred down through the years. So the key to me, it seems, in the, how do you approach the history? It is in terms of the, following the money, the interaction between presidents and faculty, students, legislature, Board of Education, or regents in more recent years. And because a lot of the student activities continue on, faculty people come and go. There's a line from one of Tom Lear's songs that we all pass and are forgotten like the rest. But the core of it, it seems to me, is the university and its politics and the difficulties that it's had in achieving its mission down through the years. So, and those problems in turn are external to the university. I think in the first place, the Montana legislature created 4 university units in 1893. They were advised by an outside commission that Montana only needed 1 unit, but politically, 4 units were necessary, apparently. The university was located in Missoula because Missoula had stayed out of the capital fight. They had not put themselves in contention as to become Montana's state capital in the 1892 election. Bozeman had nominated themselves and were unsuccessful in the first round and were awarded the state land grant school as a consolation prize in 1893. And then there was the state normal school, a teacher's college in Dillon, and a school of mines in Butte. So immediately, the territorial legislature, state legislature, was responsible for supporting 4 university units. Although there were not many people in Montana, there was not a lot of money. So there's been a history of chronic underfunding. There were a limited number of students. There was a duplication of courses and degrees. Consolidation efforts were rejected politically over a number of years. And there were also outside political attacks and interference from time to time, raising academic freedom, autonomy issues. So those stresses in turn caused many university presidents to resign or be fired. There was a Time magazine article at one point that called the University of Montana the graveyard of presidents because generally the tenure of presidents was relatively short. So the university started with those disadvantages, and some of those issues have persisted down through the years. The university had relatively humble beginnings, and I've covered this at page 7-6, 7-7 of my chapter. It began in the old South Side School in Missoula, the Willard School, which was loaned by the city of Missoula. The school had been condemned. It was reconditioned with a $5,000 contribution by Missoula citizens. The university occupied it for 3.5 years until buildings could be constructed on the campus. So the school begins, it's authorized by the legislature in 1893. The school begins in 1895. The first president is Dr. Oscar Craig, who served until 1908. And the school began with 4 faculty members and about 50 students. But at this time, the high school system in Montana was not really prepared to teach college preparatory work. There were only 5 accredited high schools. That number increased to 22 by 1904, but the number of students at the university was heavily preparatory in nature, not true university quality. And that continued until 1900 or so. So part of what President Craig was trying to do was to encourage the development of high schools in Montana so that they could provide students who could do college level work. Initially, there was no distinction between college and preparatory work. It was all the same. And finally, that situation ended in 1908. The school was small for a number of years. By 1908, there was, according to Denison, there were only 393 students. According to Merriam, there were about 200 and some. So there was a relatively small enrollment. There was really very little funding in that time. The initial income was only $13,000 in 1895. It increased to $59,000 in 1907. Professors earned $1,200 to $2,100, relatively low salaries. And Craig was trying repeatedly to get more money from the university, for the university, and he just couldn't do it. There's a reference at page 7-7 that in 1905, he exclaimed that appropriations asked for the university have been the smallest amount possible and still maintain the life of the institution. There's certainly time for the Commonwealth of Montana to reverse this policy to provide means commensurate with the work to be accomplished. So that plea didn't attract much response. And it's interesting to consider if William Clark, for example, had been like Leland Stanford and chosen to spend some of his millions of dollars to endow a university in memory of his son, Paul, as Leland Stanford did in memory of Leland Stanford Jr., there might have been a Clark University in Montana, which would be the Stanford University of the North, but that never happened. So Craig got the university off to a good start. Merriam says that at the end, and I've put into my chapter comments by Merriam as to each summarizing the contributions of each president in turn. There's a question as to why President Craig, whether he retired because of poor health. Denison says that Craig was being pressed to resign because of disagreements with the Board of Education and with Professor Elrod. Merriam doesn't mention that. But Merriam says that at this point, 1908, that Craig could look at the university with considerable satisfaction. It had departments well manned by able faculty, expanding library, a growing museum. Its research was recognized and pursued, even if intermittently. There were prospering sports teams, social and artistic groups. Was small, immature, and conventional, but it was reaching out for the future. So Craig had given the university a good start. The next president the second president was Dr. Clyde Dunaway. And by coincidence, I was a law clerk for Dr. Clyde Dunaway's son, Ben Dunaway, who was a Ninth Circuit judge in San Francisco in 1964, 65, when I clerked for him. Ben Dunaway was born at Stanford in 1907. He must have lived in Missoula as a small child during the years when his father was president. It was not something we never discussed, but the University of Montana was a part of Judge Dunaway's life as a boy. Dunaway wanted to move the university ahead as rapidly as possible. He tried to organize and develop the university along the lines adopted by the Association of State Universities, higher admission standards, 2 years of general studies, 2 years of advanced work, professional courses in law, medicine, or engineering. And he needed more money as a budget, increasing the budget from 60,000 to 100,000. The impression that I've gotten from the Merriam material is that Dunaway was pushing the university too far, too fast, and antagonizing people as he went along, so that there was a conflict with the law school as to he wanted to start a law school. There was a question about whether faculty should be Missoula lawyers or faculty coming in from out of state. The decision was made to hire out of state faculty, but that was one of the reasons, I think, why Dunaway was dismissed. His contract had been renewed in 1911 for a year, but in the fall, 2 alumni and 3 students asked for an investigation as to what was going on, and without giving him a hearing or without any investigation, they didn't renew his contract. A contract expired in September 1912. Dunaway asked for reconsideration, said he'd never been given a hearing. The board reconsidered it, but reaffirmed the decision, and so Dunaway was fired and left. Merriam's conclusion is that he left the presidency without bitterness, knowing his years had been good for it. He had set high standards, enjoyed cooperation of people he respected. He left and became the president of the University of Wyoming, and then president of Colorado College, and taught history at Carleton College, University of California, and Stanford. So at this point, it's a little shaky in Missoula, and Dunaway, I think, was really punished for maybe being too demanding in relation to what the community was willing to accept. The third president was Edwin Craighead. He was president from 1912 until 1915. The school developed under his tenure. He was interested in pursuing the idea of consolidation, that the university units should be consolidated to eliminate duplication of courses. The legislature had established an administratively unified University of Montana, but did not approve consolidation. And there was a voter consolidation initiative that failed by a 2-3 margin of the people in the state of Montana. So despite the improvements that Craighead made, there was again dissatisfaction with his administration, and he also was his contract was terminated and not to be renewed at a Board of Education meeting. Craighead had been popular with the students. The school had grown under his administration, but again, I think what did him in probably was his interest in pursuing the idea of consolidation and eliminating duplication of classes. Craighead's dismissal was investigated by a committee of the American Association of University Professors, and that conclusion was that the board's procedure and the termination of Craighead was unjust to him and disastrous in results. And the report also commented on the difficulties under which a University of Montana president operated. Anyone have any comments or questions so far? I can pause for a moment. Okay, I can see that, that the time is passing and there's a lot to go through here. And I'm not going to be able to do this in detail as to each of these presidents. I would encourage you to look at the chapter, but I think I can just trace the general trends here and you can follow the details for yourselves in the materials. Dr. Sisson, Edward Sisson, was president between 1917 and 1921. The university was affected by the war as faculty went to war. The university continued, but coming back, the political climate was conservative and repressive, and that has come up in other ways. Sisson encouraged formation of faculty committees, approved faculty actions to increase faculty participation. The Budget and Policy Committee was created during those years. And there were a hard core of faculty who developed during the 1920s who continued to keep the university going in a steady and progressive way through financial hard times and circumstances. But the problem here, again, was that there was not enough money and a conservative atmosphere. And finally, Sisson resigned. He was in poor health. He did not enjoy being president and so much, and he resigned in 1921 and continued to teach at Reed College and elsewhere. The next president was Dr. Charles Clapp. He served from 1921 to 1935. His was the longest tenure before George Dennison. And what was going on here was that enrollment was increasing. The funds to support the university were not increasing. And there was a bond issue that a taxation had been approved by the voters, but it didn't produce enough funds. It had to be restarted again. And in 1931, Clapp wrote to Chancellor Elliott, "I am blocked at every turn by lack of support and money." The upper division student body had more than doubled during his tenure, but the annual maintenance sum was for the same as it had been in 1922-23. So the enrollment was increasing, the support was not increasing. There wasn't enough money to do what needed to be done. During Clapp's tenure was the time when the first student union building was built. I've covered this at pages 17, 18. The students voted to assess themselves $1 a year to pay for the building. There was a $60,000 grant from the Federal Emergency Administration, $240,000 loan in 1933. The loan was to be repaid through student fees and building earnings so that the university would not go into debt. The building was built. There was a lawsuit that challenged the student fee because under the Montana Constitution, tuition should ever be free at the University of Montana, or the political code, but the Montana Supreme Court held that this activity fee was not tuition because it was really for student activities and approved the fee. So this, and by this time, Montana, the United States, is involved in the Great Depression, and there's a limited funds available. The faculty salaries were decreased by 20% during that time, but the university hung in there. Scholarly standards continued to improve. Schools were added. Cultural life was thriving, according to Merriam. There was a College of Arts and Sciences, schools of business administration, education, forestry, journalism, law, music, pharmacy, largely what was there in the 50s and 60s. But Merriam concludes as to Clapp that he struggled through his 14 years because of insufficient financial support, inadequate office staff, chancellors meddling in matters which should have been handled on the campus, and he became ill in 1935, and he died in office. And Merriam says that Clapp almost literally worked himself to death. And he did a great job. He was a job well done, but it was just more than he could handle. There was an interim president then, Professor Frederick Schoich, until the next president was appointed, who was Dr. George Simmons. This was a period of, before I get started, is any comments, questions so far? Okay. This was a contentious period from 36 to 41. There were downtown businessmen who were unhappy that President Clapp had not done an adequate job in marketing the university throughout the state. And they wanted someone who would be more of a salesman. So they proposed that Dr. George Simmons, who was an assistant professor in the zoology department, be appointed president. He was opposed by the faculty president selection committee. Simmons had gotten poor reviews from prior employment, and the Board of Education appointed him anyway. And this led to then a period of contentions that lasted until Simmons was forced to resign in 1941. And I've covered that basically around page 7-20 of my chapter. There were professors who tried to get Simmons fired. There were legislators who tried to get Simmons fired. The Board of Education supported him and fired instead some of the professors who were out to get Simmons, including Professor Merriam. Merriam was eventually reinstated, but that situation just continued until 1941. At that point, Sam Ford, who was then a newly elected governor, appointed new Board of Education members, and the board then told Simmons in April 1941 that conditions were so bad that they could only be improved through his resignation, and Ford gave him just a few hours to resign before he would be fired. So Simmons resigned as of September 1941, but Merriam says that despite those problems, achieved substantial accomplishments during his years. Several buildings were built, and new courses were offered, and he credits the faculty for having made those improvements. He says that the university is made up of leadership from the administration, from the president. The faculty is responsible for setting the university curriculum, and the students are also responsible to express their needs and ways for fulfilling them. So all three need to accept praise and blame for whether good things happen or bad things happen. When you get into the 40s and 50s, Dr. Ernest Melby became president in 41 through 45, but he also served as chancellor. He resigned as president to serve as chancellor of the university for a year during 43, 44. He came back. He was unable to accomplish much, and finally he resigned in 1945. Miriam says that his tenure was too short to solve the problems that he saw. But James McCain, who came in then in 45 through 50, had to deal with the problems of returning veterans, a substantially sudden increase in enrollment made up of veterans. The university had a 76% increase in students. Its faculty increased from 94 instructors to 189 from between 1945 and 1949. So this was a period of expansion. There was more money after World War II, and McCain was an able president, well-liked, well-respected. Finances improved. Buildings were proposed but not built. And finally, McCain resigned to become president of Kansas State, and Miriam gives him a very favorable report. He said that McCain left after a powerful post-war period of 5 years with a glowing record of administrative achievement, significant development. Now, we then get into the 50s and 60s, and this approaches the period when I was a student there. Carl McFarland became president in 1951. He was the first university graduate to become president. He had received a BA degree and a master's degree, a law degree from the University of Montana. He had been a clerk and commissioner for the Montana Supreme Court. He worked in the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. He practiced law in Washington, D.C., but he was an authoritarian, and McFarland did his best to increase funding and to reduce duplication of courses with other units, and to defend the university against charges that its speakers were subversives. But he didn't get along well with the faculty, and there were really strong factions during those years who either supported him or opposed him. And finally, there was a dispute with the legislature over whether with the Board of Education, over whether how university budgeting should be handled. University enrollment had declined. The Board of Education insisted that budgets be cut, but faculty salaries be increased by 4%. McFarland cut the budget, didn't raise the faculty salaries, argued that his budget shouldn't be cut, so he could raise the faculty salaries. And that contention eventually led to his resignation in 1958. There was an interim period with Dr. Gordon Castle in 1957, 58, 60 or so, 59. Dr. Castle was a conciliator. He was well regarded. He tried to repair the damage in faculty administration relationships that had occurred during the McFarland years, and but he was replaced then by Harry Newbern in 1959. Newbern had a distinguished record as both as an administration and had come from the Ford Foundation. He had been president of the University of Oregon, but he also was arbitrary. Did not get along with the faculty, and just the relationships there were very difficult. So he resigned in 1963. He came to Arizona State to accept a position. And I think Gordon Castle also came to Arizona State at about that time. So that whole experience was unsatisfactory, although the university did continue to grow. Robert Johns then was president from 1963 to 1966. He also did things his way. He was a planner. He thought he knew what was right. Miriam says that he was a dominating person who had difficult relationships with organizations. He decided that the students needed a new student union, so he was going to give them one whether they voted for it or not. And that led to the creation of the student union building that is now there. But he resigned in 1966. He was replaced by Vice President Robert Panzer, who continued until 1974. Panzer was well regarded. He had been he also had received a bachelor's degree in business and a doctor's law degree from the university. He practiced in Montana. He was vice president at the University of Montana. He was knowledgeable and well regarded, and apparently there were difficult times in the late 60s with student unrest and demonstrations, which Miriam and Dennison say Panzer handled as well as he could. So that is the end of the first part of this history. That's as far as Miriam goes. He does not talk about the presidents. Obviously, since he wrote the book, there were several: Richard Bowers, Neil Buckelew, James Koch, George Dennison, Royce Engstrom, Sheila Stearns, Seth Bodner, are all beyond this. And I decided that I would not attempt to do independent research to develop what occurred during the tenure of each of those presidents, except to a degree for Dennison. So this is really a quick summary of the first 75 years. There was a question: was there a President Gillespie at one point? No, there was not. I've not heard the name Gillespie. I'm not familiar with that. Any other questions? Well, you're very quiet. As I say, it is hard to look at this. When I read Miriam's book, and I would encourage you to read it if you can find one. He is a very objective, very professional. He's a gentleman. He tries to find something good to say about everyone. And the fact is that these were really, really difficult times from the beginning all the way through the first 75 years. And it was just a combination of not enough money, outside interference, friction between presidents and faculty over the degree to which faculty should participate in administrative affairs. But through that, the university continued to grow. Well, fast forward then to from 1970, when Miriam wrote his book, to 1990, when George Dennison became president. There's a question here: were there any clear factors that drove increased enrollment? economics, growth of certain schools, and so on. That is hard to say. My impression is that these schools and colleges were simply added one by one as opportunities presented themselves. And it may have been also that during these years, Montana's population was growing, and there was a need and the ability to expand enrollment. That certainly continued during the period from 1990 until 2010. In 1990, enrollment was about 10,500. During the next 20 years, it increased to over 15,000, and that may have been baby boomers coming into the school system. For whatever reason, university enrollment increased by that amount, and Montana State increased also in about that amount. They were running very close to each other in enrollment. But a long time back, the university had traded the engineering school for the pharmacy school. That engineering was at the university, and it went to Bozeman in exchange for the pharmacy school, which went to Missoula. And obviously, Bozeman got the better of that trade. And so the engineering school provided a basis for developing the college generally, and the university did not have anything that compared with that. Another, when you look at the competition, though, the competition is not just Montana State, it's schools in other states. I've included a reference to Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, which is in some ways quite similar to the University of Montana. It is in a relatively small city, Flagstaff, which is about the size of Missoula. It started with as a teacher's college in 1899 with 23 students and 2 faculty members. It was very small until after World War II, but it then mushroomed and now has then had 21,000 students in about 2020, 150 bachelor's programs, and but it's in a different position, which is another consideration here. Flagstaff is close to Phoenix, a large metropolitan area. It provides relief from Arizona State University and the University of Arizona. And so it has advantages in terms of enrollment that, with Arizona being a growing state, that the Montana schools just do not have. I've attached, let's see, a couple of questions here. Is there any mention of Panzer and the start of Black studies in 1968? Merriam doesn't go into that. Dennison just goes into it very briefly, and he gives, I guess Merriam gives Panzer credit for dealing with the racial issues in the 60s, but I don't personally know much about that. And that's another question to speak to the student unrest in the 60s and 70s versus the war years. Well, during the war, many faculty and students left to be in the military during World War II. So all of those men were gone. They were replaced by military trainees who sort of filled the places of the former students. And so there was not much going on during the war, certainly nothing in terms of unrest. There was a patriotic feeling, and the military was there through these trainees. but the 60s and 70s were quite different. There was student unrest in many schools, not just in Montana, but in many places, in part protesting against the Vietnam War, partly racial issues. So there was that difference. You know, when I've given you and I think was handed out, was passed out yesterday. There's an article about enrollment at the university system generally, from the Montana Free Press, a very good article summarizing what occurred in the system generally. And university enrollment is a function of demographics, not just in Montana, but elsewhere, because what has happened in Montana is that the number of high school graduates has declined by 4% from 2011 until the present. And a smaller percentage of them go into four-year schools in Montana. So there's a declining demographic, there's a declining what is called capture rate. And instead, more of those high school students are either going into two-year colleges or not going to college at all. And so that reduces the applicant pool that's available to units in the state of Montana generally. Now, what Montana State has been able to do is to ride the trend toward more practical education through its engineering schools, in particular technical schools, so that its enrollment has increased from 2011 until the present. In 2011, there were about 15,000 students at Montana State, and there are now 16,600. It has leveled off at that level. It has not declined. But the university enrollment did decline from about over 15,000 when Dennison retired and Royce Engstrom became president. It has declined steadily until it has leveled off at around 10,000 students. And I followed this through the years, and there are in the chapter references to newspaper articles that specify what enrollment was during each of those years. And the enrollment, the question I had when I updated the book was, what was the enrollment going to be in the fall of 2022? And it turns out that the total enrollment is down slightly from where it was the year before. I also sent a press release that was provided by the university about fall 22 enrollment, and it says that more than 1,351 first-year students were welcomed to campus. Total number is 1,425. Well, there were 3,700 new first-year students at the university at Montana State. So the ratio there is more than almost 3 to 1 first-year students at Montana State to University of Montana. The head count in 2022 was 9,955, but there were 10,106 in the fall of 2021. So there's been a slight decrease in the number of total students from the fall to from 2021 to 2022. So, so what has caused that and what can be done about it? Certainly the sexual abuse scandal that surfaced in 2011 or so didn't help. That was it generated a lot of bad press nationally. It led to a substantial decrease in the number of out-of-state students coming in. But I think another more general problem has been the question of the relevance and practicality of the courses that are in fields that are offered at the University of Montana in relation to those at Montana State or elsewhere, because there's an increasing, as colleges become more expensive, students become more interested in careers, going to college for a career to earn more money than they would if they didn't go to school. And so the University of Montana State has benefited from that, and the University of Montana did not. Instead, what I believe happened was that the University of Montana got into a negative spiral that where there was declining enrollment, which led to declining funding, which led to decreased faculties and required cuts in programs, and that has spiraled downward until finally I think it has stabilized. There was the one episode that occurred in the fall in 2015, 2016, I mentioned in the chapter, and that is that the declining enrollment was not always handled well. The university was required to report to the state what its enrollment figures were so that the budget, the appropriations would be set accordingly. There were estimates provided each spring. In the fall of 2015, there was an estimate that provided for like 3.8% decline, and money was appropriated on that basis. But it turned out that enrollment declined by more than 6%, and the university was slow in reporting that. It went on the website, but it wasn't, I guess, reported to the state. And when the state found out about it, the funds were cut immediately, and that produced a $5 million budget shortfall, which required terminating 200 positions, some of which were empty, some of which were retired, but a number of faculty were laid off, and that created an uproar, which sort of continued through the next year until finally in the fall of 2016, Dr. Royce Engstrom was fired, and Sheila Stearns became interim president, and then Seth Bodner was hired. But I have, and maybe some of you can help me here, I have looked to see what the university is doing to not just market its programs, but to adjust its course offerings to make them more relevant and practical to attract students to careers in these fields that would be challenging and interesting. I see the alumni magazines and the publications of press releases, and I don't see much of that. But I think that's what needs to be done, because, for example, one of the worldwide phenomenons is climate change. All right, climate change has an adverse effect on forests. It would be possible, perhaps, to have a forestry course or degree or program that would be called something like, developing and managing forests in an era of climate change, to tie what's being offered to a current environmental issue, a long-term major issue. And I don't know if the forestry school at the University of Montana is doing that or not. And you could carry that across, that the traditional knowledge and learning is simply not satisfying to students who want to go to college to gain careers, to make money and be engineers or doctors or whatever they're going to be. So I guess at this point, I would welcome your your questions or comments. Am I being fair? Am I unfair? You agree with what's happening? What's the situation? Because where does the university go from here? Or for example, if it's stabilized at 10,000 students approximately, will it ever grow to back to 15,000 or where it was? And maybe the numbers game isn't that important. It's more the quality of the education and the relevance of what's being taught, and courses that are attractive to not just to Montana students, but to attractive to out-of-state students who pay more in tuition and are a supply of students in addition to that available in Montana. There's a comment here. College enrollment has declined nationally since 2010. Is it your belief that the decline in enrollment at U of M is more significant? Well, yes, it is. The decline in enrollment at the University of Montana is about 40%, from 15,600 to about 10,000. There has been some decline nationally, but not to that extent. And you have to look at it more specifically. For example, Montana State has not declined. Montana State has been able to attract more out-of-state students. Two-year college programs have expanded to some degree as students are trying to find courses that will offer credentials that they can go into careers. It's University of Arizona State, for example, enrollment has increased, so it's now over 140,000 students, which is incredible, and that's because of an active leadership program to expand the university. University of Arizona has increased to 58,000 students, and that may be a function of population within the state of Arizona and elsewhere. Comment, yes.
Yes, on your speaking about environmental studies, University of Montana is now offering a master's degree in environmental studies, looking toward climate change and some of those issues. A very notable graduates, alumni, have come out of that program that are in positions of influence throughout the nation right now. It's very impressive in my respect to that.
Okay, well, that's one. Can that be? Are there other examples in other fields where something like that is being done? I mean, I just pulled that one out of the air as something that occurred to me.
Sure.
And like marine bio, maybe you can't teach marine biology if it's not near an ocean, but there are schools that teach environmental biology, marine biology, dealing with the oceans, and it's another environmental issue. Okay, there's a question here. Most colleges teach a lot of non-relevant professional stuff. Why is it more of a problem for U of Montana than other schools? Well, I think that is a problem for all schools, the decline of liberal arts. I was a liberal arts major and enjoyed it, and I learned a lot of things. But when I graduated with that liberal arts degree, I did not have a profession or occupation or skill that I could apply directly to anything. And from my perspective, I guess it didn't matter, because I had decided I would go to law school and I would learn a trade by going to law school, but which would take another 3 years. So I did that. But what happened at the University of Montana was that I think the enrollment declined most, and again, maybe it's chicken and egg. The enrollment declined in the humanities area, and those programs were cut, which led to less enrollment which led to more cuts. And so there was a vicious cycle where the humanities were bearing the brunt of the burden of the enrollment reduction. And, it's hard to say whether that's fair or not. My impression is that these decisions became like a circular firing squad where nobody wanted to cut their own program, but were looking to cut others. And the result was to cut the humanities disproportionately, with the rationale, I think, that humanities were not preparing people directly for jobs, and the university should concentrate on the schools and departments that were, so that enrollment would be preserved in that way, and humanities were expendable. And that's when the big picture, that's unfortunate, because people need to learn about the subjects in the humanities, but you can't translate that into flipping burgers at Wendy's or something, or using it in any significant way. And there's a tension in universities, I think, between teaching humanities and liberal arts on the one hand and preparing people for specific jobs or careers on the other. It's a matter of balance, and that's where the cuts, the burden of cuts were.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yes.
I'm new to Missoula, moved here a little over a year ago to be with family. But I think the University of Montana is one of the most beautiful campuses I've seen. And my background, my experience, I'm a journalism major. I had all of my education in the state of Iowa. But my first 2 years of college were at a small church college founded by the Danish community in Des Moines, Iowa. That church college, which was kind of on its dying breath, it developed a nursing program kind of to keep it going, but it was really failing. Wasn't attracting new students. It was leadership. Brought in a president, the first president of the college that had never been, it had expanded to 3 years and then kind of moved to 4 years, but it was very tepid. Brought in a president, first one that was not an ordained minister, first one who did not have a doctorate. His leadership took that school from a failing barely four-year college to now a university level with massive construction, building, and a demand, because they've been able to, even if it's a private school, to keep it affordable. Have added football and wrestling to bring more men in, because the nursing program brought in women. So I would say to you, it is leadership. It's leadership of the board of directors. It's leadership from the president. And it's got to involve not just the student body, the alumni, but the entire community.
That's good.
There are great programs there that I look at. The writing program, the writing workshop. There's some great things going on there.
What was the name of your school?
Grandview University.
Mm-hmm.
And then I attended Drake University, which is also another private school. Mm-hmm. And their journalism program was outstanding. But we also had Meredith Publishing. At one time, it had Look Publishing, had television, and almost all of the professors had worked in their professional area. So there were people with a lot of ground level experience.
Okay. Well, my sense, again, from afar, reading what happened year by year in the newspaper articles and talking with people, is that the spiral downward at the university began in about 2011. It continued through 2015. Then Royce Engstrom got into the problem of not having reported the decline properly and was terminated. And also, I think, because there was dissatisfaction with how he had dealt with the decline. And then it continued to spiral downward until Seth Bodner came in, whose credentials were that he was a leader. He was not an academic. He did not have a PhD. He had taught a little bit at West Point. He was, considered, I think, inadequate by more traditional faculty who thought that he should have more university experience. But as I say in my chapter, he persuaded the Board of Regents that he could lead anything, and whether it was military or business or education, it didn't matter. And that was his ticket to becoming president. And it's now been nearly 5 years, and the downward spiral has continued. So, I don't want to pick on President Bodnar at all. That's not my purpose here. And because it may be that the problem is just bigger than any one person can handle. But I don't know what's going on within the faculty and administration to continue to deal with these issues. Someone mentioned the environmental studies program, which is great, but I don't know whether that's across the board or if there's a developed strategy to improve enrollment through providing more relevant professional and occupational courses. Does anyone know what's happening in that regard? It may be that the university will just settle at this level. Does someone have I thought I saw something there. Okay. When in about 2017, my wife and I were invited to a board meeting of the Montana Tech Foundation. They met in Arizona, and it was right after President Engstrom had been fired. And I asked the chancellor, who was of Montana Tech, who was at this meeting, what his prediction was as to how long the downward spiral would continue. And he thought that maybe it would bottom out at about 10,000 students if it did bottom out. Otherwise, it might not. And he wasn't really sure how it would go. But it may be that the answer is that the university can stabilize its enrollment at that level, and which leaves it with surplus plant and equipment, I suppose, and just continue as it's doing. But in a way that's like Butte, what is the path to the future? Is there any realistic prospect that enrollment will grow back to what it was? And if so, why and how is that going to occur? And I don't know that there's clear vision about that. Like there isn't necessarily a clear vision about how Butte is going to grow. It's just people are doing different things, and it's there are details about ups and downs in different categories of students, but it's not building back to where it was. So, well, I wanted to provide, full opportunity to discuss these things with you, if anybody wants to do that. The history is, the first 75 years is sort of depressing, I suppose, because there are all of these structural issues and interferences and financial problems and disputes between faculty and administration that but still the university persists and it grows and thrives during those years. And then all of a sudden it doesn't. And that can be explained in part by changing trends in Montana demographics, but part of it has to do with the courses that are being provided and the role of the university in current society. And whether that's going to change or improve really depends upon the faculty who are there and the leadership in the administration to cause that to happen. And I guess that's all I will say about that, if there aren't any other comments or questions. Okay, well, last call. Okay. Well, I will start on newspapers, and there isn't obviously time to get through that today, but we can continue with it next week because there are several different stages in the history of newspapers in Montana. And again, what I was doing here was starting from a book written by Dennis Swibold, who is, I believe, still on the faculty of the journalism department at the University of Montana. The book is called Copper Chorus. It was received award, published in about 2007. It's received awards for its reporting. The book concerns Montana's newspaper history from 1864, when the first territorial paper was published, until 1959, when Anaconda's newspapers were purchased by Lee Newspapers. And so I have followed that book in doing this chapter in this presentation, and haven't gone beyond that in terms of what's happened in newspaper history under Lee Newspapers since 1959. But there are several major periods in that newspaper history, and maybe I can just start with this generally and then fill it in next week. The first period was the early territorial period, where there were relatively strong independent papers. They were either Democratic or Republican in their points of view. I've specified what they were and some of their positions in pages 6-2 and 6-3. But they were independently owned, and they were, I think, followed the goals of a free independent press to call things as they saw them from their own point of view, not beholden to any other interests, and they competed with each other in that way as Montana grew. Montana had, a couple of different levels of papers. One was the papers, the more metropolitan papers, which were in the cities, which started out as weeklies and became daily papers. And then there were a lot of small independent weekly newspapers in the smaller counties outside the major populated areas, which concentrated more on local news and gossip and comings and goings and social life, which not really involved as much in the social and political issues of the time. But that began to change when William Clark again became involved. He bought the Butte Miner in 1881, which before had been a Republican weekly newspaper owned by a man named James Mills, who also had other newspapers, one in Helena. And Clark turned that into a Democratic-oriented daily. I'm not doing a pun here, but daily, daily newspaper, to promote his own point of view. And you have to consider that at this time, the way politicians and other influential people communicated their views was through the newspapers. It was before radio, before television, before the internet. And so Clark began to use the newspapers to promote his own point of view about whatever social issues were involved, about how his mining interests were being handled, his views about the community, about politics generally. And then when Marcus Daly became involved in the feud with Clark, based in Anaconda, And with his prior contact with George Hurst, who had been one of the syndicate members that founded the Arizona Anaconda Company, Daley also saw the benefit of having a newspaper to promote Anaconda, promote his interests, promote Anaconda's and interests, and Anaconda, the company's interests. And so that led to the creation of the Anaconda Standard. Now, Daley could do that because he had the money and was willing to spend the money to have a quality daily newspaper in Anaconda, even though the population didn't justify it. And that was generally true of other papers as well. There were multiple newspapers in Butte. There were not enough people or advertising to support all of those newspapers. They were supported by contributions by their owners who used them to promote their own points of view. So the Anaconda Standard was developed. It was published in Anaconda, but it had its the largest subscription base was in Butte, where the miners and the larger population were. So the Anaconda Standard had a Butte news bureau that published at least a couple of articles, a couple of pages of material about Butte news every time, and then competed directly with Clark's Butte Miner. Now, where newspapers were weaponized, if you want to use the term, I guess, were first in the capital city battles in 1892 and 1894, where they were, arguing for which city should become Montana state capital. The Butte papers, Clark's papers, then in 1892 supported Butte, which I guess I hadn't fully appreciated. I thought that Clark would have supported Helena from the beginning, but he supported Butte. Butte did not survive that first cut. And but when in the 1894 election, then the Butte Miner heavily supported Helena, and the Anaconda Standard supported Anaconda, and Daley acquired other newspapers and Clark to promote that point of view. So the transition here is from independent newspapers who are true to the First Amendment, are expressing their own independent beliefs, as opposed to newspapers that are simply the weapons of people who are using them to promote their own particular point of view. There's a question here going back to the University of Montana. There has been discussion of a medical school at UM that seemed to go nowhere. Why is that? Short answer is I don't know. It may be that I think what happens is that students from Montana who go out of state to medical school are given a grant or subsidy that pays at least some part of the medical school tuition, so that Montana has decided that the needs of Montana students who want to go to medical school can be provided by paying for them to go elsewhere. Whether they come back or not is, I guess, a different question. But if they are able to send students to medical school on that basis, then there's no particular reason to have all of the effort and expense required to do a medical school in Montana. Maybe there just aren't enough people to justify that. Does anybody know about that? Is that a fair comment?
Yeah,
okay. Yeah,
that's for sure. That's a fair comment. It's called a whammy program, and involves a group of states, bordering states that go to University of Washington or University of Utah, and but there is a program, an osteopathic school that's being proposed for Billings right now. So whether that happens or not, we'll see. But that would add physicians to Montana too.
Is
So,
that being proposed by for the state, part of the university system, or a private school?
No, it's a private. My
Private.
understanding, it's not a state.
Yeah, well, the other thing is that the support from Montana state government for the university system in general has declined, so that universities have been forced to do their own private fundraising and compete for research grants to improve their financial position. And it may be that the support for a medical school would have to come from the legislature, and the legislature just may not be interested in putting money toward a medical school when they can get by with providing students an opportunity to get medical school education elsewhere.
You bet. Yeah.
And if a private school comes in, I guess then the question would be, who is doing that and where do they think those students would come from?
Yeah.
This is an interest, maybe this is an aside, but my primary care doctor is a Mexican national. He's practiced medicine in Arizona for many years. He has medical students who shadow him in his examinations, and I've met several of them. But a couple of them are from Mexican medical schools, one in Jalisco and one in Guadalajara, that teach medicine in English. And the students are American students who go there because it's less expensive. And so they can complete their medical training in Mexico. And apparently that's accepted and accredited in the United States less expensively than going to medical school in the United States. And that's an alternative supply of doctors for the United States. And so you wonder if Jalisco and Guadalajara can do that. Why can't Montana? That's to provide an opportunity for medical students to have opportunity for medical education at lower cost. But I think a part of that is a medical school depends on a hospital. You have to have a relatively large hospital that can use interns as a part of their staffing. And so I don't know whether Billings has a hospital that is large enough that could use interns from a medical school in Billings, or where those students would go to have internship possibilities.
The Billings Clinic does have outreach all over Montana and actually into northern Wyoming too. So that they probably would be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, good. Well, maybe that'll happen. Well, we've used up our time for this week. I will finish with the newspaper material next time, and then we'll talk about Thomas Francis Marr and Burton K. Wheeler. And if Wilbur Sanders' great granddaughters are still in the class, I'll talk about Wilbur Sanders more next week, because he was a part of the story with Marr. Last call for questions, comments. Okay, well, hearing none, then we're adjourned until next week, and look forward to seeing you then. And thank you again for coming. I hope you've enjoyed this and appreciated your comments about the university. See you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks, Paul.